Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Our opening prayer is from the Gospel of John. Before the feast of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to pass from this world to the Father. He loved his own in this world, and he loved them to the end. Welcome to this presentation on the Passion narratives of the Gospels. This presentation is coming to you from the Altar Care St. Joseph Center in Warrensville Heights, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. The St. Joseph Center is a healthcare facility that provides occupational and physical therapy, long and short-term skilled nursing care, assisted living, independent living, hospice care, and palliative care. This presentation is going to deal with the Gospel of John. John's Gospel is a little bit different from the Synoptic Gospels. It seems almost as if John is presuming that you've read or heard one or more of the Synoptic Gospels. He is more meditative. His Gospel, in a sense, is a theological reflection more than a narrative account of the words and deeds of Jesus. Scholars believe it's written in about the 90s, and that the Gospel actually went through several stages of writing connected to the Apostle John, the beloved disciple, but that actually perhaps the last two stages were redactions done by the followers of John and were done perhaps after the apostle's death. Traditionally, John is the only apostle that dies a natural death, and he was protected and cared for by a community, and he very much was the spiritual father of that community, and they took care of his needs, and they helped him as well with the writing of his gospel. I like to think of the line from the Beatles song, "I get by with a little help from my friends." And certainly John had help from his community, the community of the beloved disciple. And as a matter of fact, they probably finished the work of the gospel in the sense of a final editing or redacting. This does not in any way hurt the canonicity or the apostolic link of the gospel in any way. John is the moving force behind the writing of this gospel, even if he himself had died before the final form of the gospel was finished. So they took care of him, and he in turn was their spiritual leader as well. John's gospel has more dialogue in it than the Synoptic Gospels, and this becomes a sort of literary device for John. Jesus will say something, he's misunderstood, or he's questioned about it. Not necessarily always in a hostile way either, but sometimes often it is. But the question or the misunderstanding leads to Jesus clarifying his thought and speaking more and leading to more knowledge and more teaching. Another device that adds drama to the whole gospel is the opposition to Jesus. And the animosity grows. His opponents first start to question him and his teaching. Then they'll start to debate him openly. They'll challenge him. Finally, they'll start to plot his death. And so there's like a crescendo throughout the gospel, not just in the Passion narrative, but throughout the gospel. And it leads finally to the seeming triumph of darkness and the plot for his death and his crucifixion. But of course we know he will triumph over death. One thing we have to clear up right away at the beginning is the idea of the meaning of the term the Jews in John's Gospel. The word is used, the title, the group of people, the Jews, is used about 70 times in the Gospel. Not all the references are negative, but many of them are. The Jews refers to anyone who is opposed to Jesus. Remember, first of all, it almost goes without saying, but it's important to remember it here in this context, Jesus himself was Jewish. The apostles were Jewish. Many of his followers were Jewish. The point is that in the term the Jews, as it is used in the Gospel, there is not an idea of anti-Semitism at all for that. And so, to keep that in mind, it's anyone who is opposed to Jesus. The world and the Jews are those who are misunderstanding of him, are opposed to him, and Jesus will overcome all of them. But it's not anti-Semitic. Jesus himself and his apostles were Jews. So was John. Now, the book, the Gospel itself, is divided into two parts. Chapters 1 through 12. It's called the Book of Signs. The signs are the miracles that Jesus did. There are 7 main ones to that first book, and it's intermingled with Jesus' teachings. Chapters 13 to 22 are called the Book of Glory. This is Jesus' exaltation, his being raised up on the cross, then raised up from death, and finally returning back to his Father. The opening prayer that I chose was from chapter 13, the beginning of chapter 13, where Jesus realizes his hour has come. It's very important, the hour. In other words, the culmination of everything of his life. And also, too, some themes that John will return to throughout his gospel and in the Passion narrative, besides the idea of the hour having come, is that of light and darkness. Keep those in mind. We'll see where John will talk about things being at night, and then the idea of the light of day. John does not have an institution narrative of the institution of the Eucharist as such. He has instead the Last Supper setting, but he speaks about the washing of the feet. That's unique to John. He doesn't deny the institution of the Eucharist, not at all, but he is emphasizing some other things. Now, this can cause some difficulties amongst interpreters. Some people have a certain agenda, and we won't get into the details of that, but you'll find it in some commentaries. And speaking about this Last Supper, or the context of the Last Supper, will ignore or neglect the idea of both the Eucharist and the priesthood, the institution, the giving to us of those two great sacraments, and will stress rather the service aspect of the washing of the feet. You have to keep all of these things in mind and put together all of the Gospels to get a certain balanced view of what is happening for this. And so the service will be stressed to the neglect of the sacraments, and we don't want to do that. But while John does not have a specific institution narrative like we find in the Synoptics, he is certainly not leaving that out or denying it for that. And so in chapter 13, when the Book of Glory begins, the Passion narrative will begin later, Passion narrative proper, but the setting here is that of this Passover feast that is here. This also causes some misinterpretations amongst modern commentators as regards the timeline. If you have heard the presentation on Mark's Gospel, you see that Mark took great pains to set up a timeline reconstructing the last week in the life of Jesus before his passion, death, and resurrection. What we have here from John is this meal that is here, and also the idea, remember, as Mark shows us, and as Luke and Matthew will agree as well, the Passover and Sabbath coincided. And because of that, if one were to observe the Sabbath, it would cause a difficulty to also be celebrating Passover. And with all of this, to keep in mind that for the Jewish reckoning, the day began the night before, sort of like our first Vespers in our liturgy in the divine office. And so, for instance, also too at Mass, where on Sundays you can have the vigil on Saturday evening. Keep all of this in mind because it will help to eradicate a lot of difficulties. And again, people push certain agendas and such. What do they do with the timeline? Well, they look at it and say, if the Passover was to be on Friday evening, and Jesus is on the cross when the lambs are being sacrificed for the Passover, that will be that Friday evening, then they are sacrificed on Friday afternoon, and that coincides at the time that Jesus is on the cross, and the symbolism of Jesus as the Passover lamb. Then, Holy Thursday, the Last Supper, in their thinking, is not a Passover meal. It's a friendship meal amongst a group of people. And so again, it lessens the importance of the Eucharist. Rather, as we saw with Mark, if you remember, the idea was that because Passover and Sabbath coincided on the same day, it was allowed in Jewish tradition to celebrate Passover one day early. And so indeed the Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus himself will say that. I have longed to celebrate this Passover with you. He saw it as a Passover meal. It has those implications and that significance. And so the idea of the institution of the Eucharist and the importance of that. So to keep these things in mind, it is not just a fellowship meal. It is the Passover. And it's done on Holy Thursday, as we celebrate it on Holy Thursday. And Jesus, of course, then is crucified on Good Friday. The timeline works out, but some will try to ignore certain parts of it in order to stress certain things, to pull away from the importance of Thursday being the day of the Last Supper, the institution of priesthood and Eucharist, and for whatever reasons or motivations. So to clear that up without spending a lot of time going through it, as a Scottish friend of mine says, we won't make heavy weather of it, but I do want to bring it up so that you are clear on it and what is being talked about here and the idea. So the idea being that the Last Supper is a Passover meal, the importance of the sacraments, and in John's Gospel also the idea of service with the washing of the feet. We saw in Luke's telling of the Passion narrative the involvement of Satan, and John will also tell us of that Satan enters into Judas. This is the time of the triumph of the powers of evil. Also, too, John makes it very clear that Jesus knows what is going to happen. Matthew had stressed this to a certain extent as well. This is not by accident. This is not without the knowledge of Jesus. This is not without his obedience to the Father's will, that this is the will of his Father and that he is obeying that. So all these things are brought together in here. The apostles, in this context of the Last Supper, ask who will be the one to deny Jesus as he speaks about this. And again, they don't have a clue. And this has been consistent through the Passion narratives. Here, in John's telling of it, the beloved disciple is the one who is called upon to ask who the betrayer is. And Jesus will note that by showing it with a gesture. And so he says, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another at a loss as to whom he meant. Again, they have no clue. Jesus never marked out Judas, even though he knew. He never treated him differently. Always the grace for reconciliation, the grace of forgiveness was there for repentance. Judas did not take it. One of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining at Jesus' side, so Simon Peter nodded to him to find out whom he meant. He leaned back against Jesus' chest and said to him, Master, who is it? So even the closest of the apostles, Peter and John, did not know. And Jesus says, it is the one to whom I hand the morsel after I have dipped it. Now, this is one of those quasi-ritual gestures. We've seen them before in the Gospels. It was a sign of respect and esteem if you had a guest of honor, for instance, at a banquet. And so he dipped the morsel, took it and handed it to Judas. But after he took the morsel, and Judas does take it, we find out in chapter 13, we're at verse 27, Satan entered him. So Jesus said to him, what you are going to do quickly. Okay, now, they thought perhaps that Judas was going to do something that was needed for the Passover feast. They still have no clue that it's Judas, but of course Jesus knows. And we continue on with some teachings of Jesus and Jesus foretelling, predicting the denial by Peter, as we've seen in the other ones as well. And chapter 14 starts a group of discourses. Chapter 15, the very famous image of the vine and the branches, and the opposition that will come to Jesus, that the world hates him, and will hate them as well. After all, if they hated Jesus, can his followers expect anything less for that? Jesus reaches out to Judas, but Judas does not take the grace of that repentance. And so he leaves. And John will make the note that it's at night. Well, yeah, sure. After all, that's when they are doing this Passover meal. But light and dark, as I just mentioned briefly before, is very symbolic for John. The night is away from the light. Jesus is the light of the world. And what Judas is doing is he's leaving the light and going out at night. He's going from the light into the darkness. And that's symbolic of him leaving Christ, the light of the world, and going out into the darkness of evil, driven there by Satan. But still he is responsible for his actions, and that's very clear as well. But he leaves at night. He's leaving the light of Christ. He's going into the darkness for that. And so he leaves. So he will not be there for the rest of the Last Supper. We weren't sure in some of the other Gospels whether Judas was there or not during the time of the institution of the Eucharist. Now, John does not have the institution. He is there for the washing of the feet, but then he leaves. And for the teachings of Jesus, especially for the final discourse, Judas is not going to be there, as a matter of fact. And so we have a long discourse to the disciples, and it is typical of what happens throughout John's Gospel. Jesus speaks, he is misunderstood, his hearers will ask questions, it gives Jesus the opportunity for further instruction. And so he speaks about these images, as I mentioned, the vine and the branches, warns them about the hatred that will come to them as it has come to him. He speaks about the coming of the Holy Spirit, and we'll know that will come at Pentecost and then will stay with the church for all time. And they don't understand it. And so Jesus explains further. We come to chapter 17 then, which is called the priestly prayer of Jesus, or sometimes the high priestly prayer of Jesus. Now, earlier on, Jesus' disciples asked him how to pray. And at that time, he taught them what we call the Our Father. This is how you are to pray. In chapter 17, the high priestly prayer of Jesus, we have an example of how Jesus himself prayed. And we see that he prays that he has fulfilled his mission given to him from his Father. He has told his followers, the disciples, about the Father. And so he prays to his Father, and he prays to his Father for them as well. He prays that they be protected and that they be unified. He prays for unity. And also, too, in this prayer of Jesus, he widens it out to all believers, all of those who will hear about Jesus through the preaching of the apostles. And so, by extension, that's everyone who is Christian, everyone who is a member of the church. And so, it's you and I. We can say, in a sense, Jesus at his Last Supper is praying for you and me. He's praying for all who will believe in him and for the unity of all of us. He prays that his name, and therefore God himself, will be revealed to others. So where a person's name is, in Jewish thought, that's what they are. The name and the person are bound very closely together. That's why the changing of a name, as I mentioned in an earlier presentation, is very important. It has a significance for this. So, again, we don't have the words of institution as we have in the other Gospels, but we do have the setting of the Last Supper. It is definitely a Passover setting, and Jesus uses it to speak to his closest associates, the apostles that are there, and to celebrate this Passover. Then, afterwards, in chapter 18, we move on to going to the garden. Judas knows about this because apparently Jesus has done it frequently before for this. There isn't any telling about Jesus going to prayer or the apostles falling asleep. Rather, he is arrested. So in the beginning of chapter 18, when he had said this, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to where there was a garden into which he and his disciples entered. Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So again, as we've seen, especially from Mark's telling of that, Jesus has made the arrangements for this Passover meal ahead of time. Judas would have been the one to make those arrangements. He kept the purse, but Jesus is not going to be disturbed at this Last Supper. So Judas knows the garden, but he didn't know the upper room. It would have been easier, tactically, if you will, to try to take Jesus in the upper room where the situation could be contained. It's a little more difficult out in the open of the garden, but Jesus is not going to resist, and neither are his disciples. An irony there. And part of the disciples, they thought that perhaps his disciples might try to save him, but of course they don't. They flee instead. So this is the situation, the practical situation, the reality that is happening there for it. Now, interestingly, in the arrest, Judas got a band of soldiers and guards from the chief priests and the Pharisees and went with lanterns, torches, and weapons. First of all, the soldiers. As we'll see, it seems to be that Roman soldiers are involved in this. So John has the possibility that there's Roman involvement even at the arrest of Jesus. The other Gospels don't show that. It's just Jewish authorities. And they bring lanterns and torches. Well, practically they would. It's at night. But again, the symbolism. They've got to bring their own artificial light. They're coming out of the dark. They would have come out and, in a sense, surprised or tried to surprise Jesus. Of course, he knows what's going to happen. But the idea of an artificial light, and they are coming out of their own darkness, out of the darkness of evil. They got to bring their own light. And they come to the light of the world himself to arrest him. And so the juxtaposition of that, there's a tremendous theological significance to that. Again, it's a frequent theme of John, the light and the dark. So that Judas leaves when it's at night, and they've got to bring their own light coming out of the night. Seems simple, maybe even superfluous to mention it, but it has that theological importance, and that's what John's trying to remind us of for this. There is no kiss of Judas. Jesus rather is in control. And it is interesting how the scene is depicted here for us. Jesus knowing everything that was going to happen to him. Again, it wasn't by accident. This is by the plan of his Father. He went out and said to them, "Whom are you looking for?" So rather than Judas saying, "It's the one I'm going to kiss," and then kissing him and that, to seize him or anything, Judas doesn't say anything. Jesus says it all. "Whom are you looking for?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said, "I am." Judas' betrayer was also with them. When he said to them, "I am," they turned and fell away to the ground. This is unique in John's telling of it. They fall back as if in awe. It stresses the dignity and the kingly aspect, role of Jesus. He's got to ask him a second time, interestingly enough. So he again asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am. So if you are looking for me, let these go." This was to fulfill what he had said. "I have not lost any of those you gave me." Okay. Then we find out now the most information about this incident, about cutting off the servant's ear. Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. Slave's name was Malchus. It's his right ear, it's Malchus, and it was Peter who did it. Interestingly enough, for that. We get these kinds of details. We were getting a little bit each time along the way, and now we find out the most from John for this. It continues on then. So the band of soldiers, the tribune, that's a Roman official. So it makes it more clear here that some Roman soldiers were involved in this. With Jewish guards, seized Jesus, bound him, and brought him to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. The high priest usually held that office for life, but we find out that that is not so. The present high priest is Caiaphas. Annas was the father-in-law. What happened was that the Romans had deposed him as the high priest. Now, interestingly, they could do this, obviously, but he still would be a power and a man of influence. And as a matter of fact, for many of the Jews, they probably would not have accepted this action by the Romans. And so he would still be considered the real, true high priest. It's interesting. We don't know too much more about the relationship there for this. But Caiaphas is the high priest. Annas was his father-in-law. Still the power behind that office. And John reminds us it was Caiaphas who was counsel of the Jews that it was better for one man to die than all the people. And of course the irony of that and the symbolism of that. Jesus is the one man who will die for all of the people for this. Then we shift to Peter's first denial. And we get some more detail here that we didn't find in the synoptics. Simon Peter and another disciple, we don't know whom. John, perhaps, maybe, some think it is. We don't know for sure, it's speculation. They followed Jesus. Now, the other disciple was known to the high priest. So basically, he's able to get in and to get Peter in as well for this, which is kind of interesting. We didn't know this from the other terms. It was just Peter by himself. They seem to go first to the house of Annas and then to the house of Caiaphas. So Annas still has a tremendous amount of influence and power. He is someone to be reckoned with, and they defer to him, even though the Romans have stripped him of that power. Again, to many of the Jewish people, the authorities and those in the Sanhedrin, he'd still be the actual true high priest, regardless of what the Romans thought. So Peter goes there, accompanied by this other disciple. Whoever it was, this disciple had connections, as we would say, could pull strings, if you will. So Peter denies Jesus. And then it shifts back to the trial again for that. During this interrogation, it is interesting as Jesus speaks boldly here. He didn't in the synoptics. But consistent with the synoptics, he does not answer a falsehood or a false charge. He speaks the truth about himself. He will answer a question truthfully if it is a true question in a sense, if it's in the right context or in the right spirit. But any false charges or a lie or that he won't answer. But he does speak boldly here. There is a give and take that goes back and forth here. So the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, about his doctrine, and Jesus answered him. And it is said he's very bold in his response. He says, I said all these kinds of things in the synagogues. When all the Jews gather, I kept nothing secret. So why ask me? Ask those who heard me. And one of the temple guards thinks this is very disrespectful, to say the least, towards the high priest, so he strikes Jesus. And Jesus responds back. If I have spoken wrongly, show me, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why did you strike me? Then Annas sends him over to Caiaphas. Then we come back and Peter denies Jesus again. So we've got a juxtaposition. It's almost like the Markan sandwich. We have the denial, Jesus proclaiming who he is, and Peter denying him again for this. Again, it's a jarring contrast. And it strikes us that it should stand out for us of what is going on. We go back to Peter then in the contrast. We have the contrast of what Peter is saying and the contrast of what Jesus is saying. Jesus giving testimony to the truth, Peter denying him. Now it is interesting in this second one, where again in chapter 18, at verse 25, now Simon Peter, who was standing there keeping warm, and they said to them, You are not one of the disciples, are you? He denied it, said, I am not. One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, said, Didn't I see you in the garden with him? And again, this is the mark of an apostle, to be seen, to be with Jesus. This mark especially emphasizes it is the first and foremost rule of an apostle to be seen, to be with Jesus. And it's exactly what he is accused of here, by none other than a relative of the person whose ear Peter cut off. How are you going to deny it? But Peter does. Again, Peter denied it, and the cock crowed. Then we move on to the trial before Pilate. Okay. So we've got this, and for the most part, in the main, the trials and charges and such, if you look at all four of the Gospels, they will agree in their general outline. The details will change a little bit for this, but it doesn't cause any problems. Again, we have different retellings of it from different sources, and the redactions, the oral telling that has preceded the written copy of the Gospels, all of these things that go in there. We don't have somebody, again, taking notes as it is happening. We have no recording of it or anything like that, obviously. And so there can be changes that creep in. But that doesn't cause any problems for us. Actually, it enriches our view when you put together all of the four Gospels and fill in details then for it. We will come back to Peter's repentance, in a sense, from his denials later on after the Passion itself. So now we have the trial before Pilate. There's no more about the trial before the Sanhedrin. There is a certain symmetry that is here. John has more than the other evangelists about the trial before Pilate. There is a symmetry. It's called a parallelism or a mirror image. It's hard to say just orally, but what you need to do is to take a look and construct the scene and see how it works, and there's a balance between the parts. And it can be graphed out, if you will. You could write it down on a piece of paper or put it on a board. And the parts would go, it can be lettered. So just in theory. And this happens in a number of places throughout the Bible. It was a common kind of technique. And so let's say we had this parallel writing. It's sometimes called a chiasm, from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. And so the parts cross, and the parts would be A, B, B, A. All right. You could have A, B, C, C, B, A. These parts, A, the first A, and the second A would be related, the first B and the second B, and then the C and the C. A, B, C, C, B, A. Usually when it's graphed out in print, it's capital A, B, C, and then small case, lowercase, C, B, A. You can also have a center that has no corresponding parts. So it would be A, B, C, D, C, B, A. Whatever is in the center is being stressed. That's the point of it. It's a literary device to stress the center. So if it's A, B, C, C, B, A, C, whatever it is, in a certain particular set of verses, is what's emphasized. If it's A, B, C, D, C, B, A, it's D. Okay, what we have here in this scene with the trial before Pilate is a symmetry of A, B, C, D, C, B, A for that. All right? So, what are these parts then? Part A, the first A, capital A, if you will, is the demand for the death of Jesus. Capital letter B is the dialogue, the talk between Pilate and Jesus. C, capital C, would be the innocence of Jesus being stated. The center, D, that has no corresponding part, is the scourging and the crowning with thorns. Then you go back to lowercase c, which is again a repeat, the stating of the innocence of Jesus. Lowercase b, again dialogue, Pilate and Jesus speaking. And then lowercase a, the demand for death, which is granted. There's the request in the first A, the demand in the second A. So that's the symmetry. It's a mirror image, in a sense. You've got the demand for the death of Jesus, Pilate and Jesus talk, the innocence of Jesus is stated, the scourging, crowning with thorns, that has no other parallel to balance it. Then, the innocence of Jesus stated again, Pilate and Jesus speaking again, and the demand granted for the death of Jesus. Now, besides that, the great artistry of John, there is another literary notion to this, if you will, in the setting. It moves between inside and outside Praetorium, where Pilate is, because basically the historical reality, it is right before the preparation for Passover. And for the Jewish authorities, and here's part of the irony and even more the hypocrisy, they don't want to contract ritual impurity before this great feast of the Passover. They don't care that they're condemning an innocent man, but they don't want to contract ritual impurity. So they don't want to go inside the place of this pagan ruler. So they stay outside. So Pilate, who doesn't care one way or the other about any of that, still he will go along with it as part of their custom. So he'll go from the inside to the outside and back and forth for it. It's just simply to placate them, that he, again, doesn't put any importance to it, but it's their custom, and well, okay. So he goes in and out. So you've got, for that, it starts with A, outside, B, inside, C, outside, the center, inside, then lowercase c on the other side, outside, lowercase b, inside, lowercase a, outside. So it goes back and forth, outside, inside, outside, inside, outside, inside, outside, for that, back and forth. So as you read it through, you'll see he's going in and out for that. I'm not going to take the time to read the entire thing all the way through of their dialogue for that. But as you read it, you'll see that, and you can reconstruct the symmetry that is in there for that as it alternates going through. The leaders stay outside due to the feast, and they don't want to be ritually impure. Okay. Now, true to form, Pilate questions Jesus about kingship. That's the same thing that we saw in the other Gospels. For the Jewish authorities, for the Sanhedrin, the charge is blasphemy. Just claiming to be a king isn't a capital crime in the first place. But that's not going to work with Pilate. But kingship, revolution, rebellion, that will get the attention of Pilate. And they know that for this. So that's why Pilate questions him about being a king. And he will state, I find no guilt in him. But still, they will whip up the crowd, as we've seen. He also speaks about releasing a prisoner at Passover. Historically, a bit of a problem. We just don't have documentation, but not outside the realm of possibility, and it buys time for Pilate, and he's hoping to mollify the crowd because he knows Jesus is innocent. But in the end, he doesn't care, and so he condemns them to death. And he allows Barabbas, son of the Father, to be freed for this, and the irony of that. He's the true person of rebellion, the rebellious one, the revolutionary. Okay, let's go to chapter 19. Pilate took Jesus and had him scourged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, clothed him in a purple cloak, sign of royalty, the purple, and came to him and said, Hail, King of the Jews. The mockery is consistent. The soldiers will mock him as a king. The Jewish authorities, Jewish guards and such will mock him as a prophet and as Messiah for this. Okay. Pilate went out and said to them, he's got to go outside because they won't come inside, so he goes outside. So here's the alternation, back and forth. Another example of it is part of this for the scenery that is here of this scene of the trial. He said to them, Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know I find no guilt in him. Declaration, the innocence of Jesus. Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple cloak, and he said to them, Behold the man. One of the famous lines of the Passion narrative. And they, of course, say, Crucify him, crucify him. So, and Pilate says, Take him yourself and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. But the Jews answered, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he made himself Son of God. The blasphemy. Now when Pilate heard this statement, he became even more afraid, went back into the praetorium, there he goes, back inside, and says to Jesus, Where are you from? Jesus did not answer him. So he stated his innocence, and now he comes back inside. Pilate and Jesus talk. There's our part of our imagery there, our symmetry going back and forth. And Pilate is amazed at this. So Pilate said to him, Do you not speak to me? Do you not know I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you? Here he thinks Jesus would be begging for mercy, begging for his life. He's not. As a matter of fact, Jesus says to him, "You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above." So Pilate tries to release him. In verse 12 we read, "Consequently, Pilate tried to release him, and the Jews cry out, 'If you release him, you are not a friend of Caesar.' Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Now, this idea of a friend of Caesar, that actually is a title. It's not just, a phrase to be taken lightly. It was an actual title that could be bestowed upon someone, and it brought some status and privilege with it. And so in using it, it's not just something that the Jewish authorities are tossing off. They're making an accusation against Pilate, in a sense. They're being rather cynical of it all, but it's something that's going to hit Pilate a little bit, not a whole lot. They can't be the ones to really give him that title or take it away from him or anything. But in doing it, they're taking a jab at Pilate. You're no friend of Caesar. That's not to be taken lightly, again, because that is an actual title that is bestowed upon someone. It has some meaning. It would have for Pilate for that. So Pilate gives in. And we have something that is a bit ambiguous. There are ambiguities, and sometimes by design, this seems to be one. In verse 13, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and seated him on the judge's bench in the place called the Stone Pavement. Now, that's the way the New American Bible that I'm reading from here translates it, placed him. But in the Greek underneath this, it just simply says he sat down. It could be he seated him in a sense that Pilate sat Jesus on the bench, or it could be that Pilate himself sat on the bench. The bench is a judgment bench, sort of think like a court, and the judge coming in and taking his seat presiding in the court, sitting on the bench. We even use the phrase today. So it's ambiguous in a sense of who was sitting down. Was it Pilate or was it Jesus? It could have been either. And this could be another one of those situations where the evangelist purposely left it ambiguous so it could be taken both ways. It's like the veil of the temple. Which veil was it? Left perhaps ambiguously so it could be taken both ways. Here, it's either that Pilate is the judge, ironically, passing judgment on Jesus. He sits on the bench and passes judgment. Or he sits Jesus down on the bench. And Jesus, of course, is the judge of the entire world for that. And so the irony of that, and to leave it ambiguous. Again, it can be taken in a number of ways. All of them have meaning for us, for it. And so Pilate does give in. And John notes for us, it's preparation day for Passover. It was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Of course, said with cynicism. They cried out, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to him, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." No king but Caesar. They certainly didn't recognize Caesar as their king. But so the irony of all that, the hypocrisy, even further, of all of that. And of course, Pilate gives in. So they took Jesus, carrying the cross himself. John doesn't tell us about Simon of Cyrene. He went to the place of the skull, in Hebrew, Golgotha. They crucified him, and with him 2 others. And Pilate had an inscription written and put on the cross, and they always would, because it was a public spectacle, and the crime was announced as a deterrent and a warning for others as to why this person was being executed. And so this is normal. And he has on the inscription, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. The Jews take exception to that. It's in several languages. John tells us Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And they'd say to Pilate, don't write King of the Jews, but rather, he said, I am King of the Jews. He made the claim. In other words, what Pilate has done is gotten a little bit of revenge. I mentioned this in talking about Mark's telling of it. The psychological battle between the authorities and Pilate. They've taken the measure of the man. He knows that they've backed him into a corner. They know, he knows that they know everything of that. And so he's getting a little bit of revenge at the end there by saying, the King of the Jews. And they say, no. They say he claimed he was King of the Jews. Pilate says, no, what I have written, I have written. It stays the way I put it. And he won't change it for that. So it's a small thing, but it's his little bit of getting back at them for that. Now, he is crucified, and there are 5 scenes to the crucifixion itself. They're not in a kind of symmetry for it, but it's just simply 5 scenes. The first one is this one of the inscription. The authorities want it changed. Pilate doesn't change it. The second scene is that of the dividing of the garments. And that is a normal practice. There is one that his tunic is woven in one piece, and so they cast lots for it. And that was to fulfill the scriptures. Then the third scene at the crucifixion are the people who are at the foot of the cross. This varies from gospel to gospel. John tells us, there's a number of people here, standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Caiaphas, and Mary of Magdala. It is not clear here whether those are 3 people or 4 people. Interestingly, if you take a look at it closely, and the Greek doesn't help us, you've got the cross of Jesus, his mother. Okay, no doubt about that. His mother's sister, second person. Mary, the wife of Clopas, third person. Or is his mother's sister, is she the Mary, the wife of Clopas? But would the sister have the same name as Mary? So it's probably a separate person. But the Greek text is ambiguous with that. But it seems you wouldn't have 2 Marys in the same family. Or is it not the sister, but maybe it is a cousin? There's something, there's ambiguity, there's possibilities there. And Mary of Magdala. Okay. And of course John is there as well, and he doesn't mention that, just the women. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple there whom he loved, and of course is John, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." This title, woman, is a title of great respect. It is used elsewhere by Jesus for his mother. And so it is not cold and certainly not disrespectful, but rather just the opposite, one of tremendous respect. Now this too, there is an ambiguity here in order to allow for a much richer interpretation. It could go either way, whichever you wish to stress for this. Now you have 2 parts to it. Behold your mother, behold your son. In both ways, Mary represents the church. And it depends which way you want to put the stress. Okay. And so let's look at it again very simply. Behold your son, behold your mother. All right. Mary is the church. The disciple can represent all Christians. And Mary, of course, is the mother of the church and mother to us all. So, as John represents all Christians, represents us, Mary is our mother. The church is also our mother for this. So, on that. Now, the other way you can look at it, it's not really in an opposite way, but it's just as simply a different stress, but it enriches the meaning. Mary, again, is the church, and John represents the apostles. Okay, in that sense, then, the apostles are in care of the church, in a sense. The apostles are the ones that give us the church. Mary is the mother of the church, but the apostles care for the church, right? And they start and begin the church at Pentecost, with the event of Pentecost. So the idea of looking at it that way, again, John is in care of Mary. Behold your mother. So John representing the apostles, here is the church, and the apostles care for the church, represented by Mary. So again, it's a matter of emphasis. It is not in any way contradictory one to the other, or exclusive one to the other, but it gives a richness and a widening of the idea for that. Again, something to meditate upon. So a bit of an ambiguity in the text, but seems purposely so for this. And from that hour the disciple took her into his home. So the apostles have the care of the church and the successors to the apostles, the Pope and the bishops of the church for this. So it continues down. Then, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. There's a vessel filled with common wine. They put a sponge soaked in wine on a sprig of hyssop and put it up to his mouth. Hyssop was used at the first Passover in the book of Exodus when the angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites that were marked by the use of hyssop, sprinkling the blood on the doorposts. So it's not a minor detail. It's very important. It has a theological significance that they put it on hyssop and give it to him. Okay. He'd taken the wine, just simply probably a little taste on his lips, and that's it. That's all he could handle. He said, it is finished. It is done. Again, tremendous stress on Jesus in control. There isn't the crying out that we saw in Mark. It was misinterpreted by the bystanders, all the noise and confusion and everything that surrounded the death of Jesus there as he's on the cross for that. Bowing his head, he handed over the Spirit. Handed over the Spirit. Double meaning there. Again, Jesus is in control. He gives up the Spirit, even to the very end in his death. Matthew has echoes of this as well. Whereas in Mark, he simply cries out for it. But here he hands over the Spirit. His Spirit, in a sense, he dies, but also the Spirit in the sense of the Holy Spirit, who, of course, will come at Pentecost for this. But he hands over the Holy Spirit to the church for this. So again, a double meaning there and a very rich theological meaning. Bows his head, hands over the Spirit. Now, we go on with some more details. Since it is the preparation day, in order that the bodies might not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, okay, because again, Passover and Sabbath are coinciding here this particular year. They go to Pilate, they ask if the bodies could be taken down. The soldiers come to break the legs, and they do that of the other two because they're not dead yet. By breaking the legs, the person being crucified could not lift themselves up in order to be able to exhale, and so died very quickly of asphyxiation, if they had not already died from the exhaustion and the loss of blood. But Jesus is already dead, so they do not break his legs. It's much simpler and easier to just pierce his side than to try to break both legs. And that fulfills the scripture. The Passover lamb was to be cooked, roasted whole without breaking any of its bones. And that fulfills the scripture. The bones are there. And John, of course, gives us those scripture passages. The two of them, not a bone of it will be broken, and they will look upon him whom they have pierced for this. For it. And John notes too, immediately blood and water flowed out. Medically, this is possible from the sac that surrounds the heart. There is both blood and water that would come out. And of course, theologically, blood and water, the Eucharist, and baptism are symbolized there for this, and the importance of that. The burial of Jesus then, Joseph of Arimathea, John tells us he's secretly a disciple of Jesus. We wondered about him in the other tellings. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, as we find out from the other accounts, how this worked out with the trial of Jesus and what might have been impossibilities there. How did he figure into that? But he's a secretly disciple. He comes with Nicodemus. We met Nicodemus in John's Gospel. Met him in the 3rd chapter where he comes at night. Again, out of darkness, goes to the light, talks with Jesus, asks him questions. Then we meet him again, Nicodemus, in the 7th chapter, when they're plotting against Jesus. And Nicodemus speaks up. Now, he won't mention Jesus by name, but he will remind the plotters, those members of the Sanhedrin that are in on this, that it is the custom not to condemn someone without hearing them out, and to be fair in the trial. So in a sense, he obliquely stands up for Jesus without really tipping his hand that he's a disciple. He just simply says, we've got to follow the legal law here, and we should give him a hearing and a fair trial. And that's as far as he goes. Now, he actually shows his faith by coming out and helping to bury Jesus. And he's taking a risk from both the Roman side and the Jewish side in doing this. They took the body down, bound it in a burial cloth, which will become what we now know as the Shroud of Turin, for those who take stock in that. And it is a very powerful relic. There's debate about whether it's authentic or not, but it's still authentic or not. It tells us a tremendous, tremendous amount for this. And so the burial cloths that are there, and he's put into a tomb. They bring a large amount of the spices that will be used, and that shows that it is a royal burial, a kingly burial, in the details that are there. That moves us into chapter 20, and we have the resurrection, of course, the empty tomb. And as I've mentioned before, the empty tomb in and of itself is not a proof of the resurrection. They could have the wrong tomb. They could have stolen the body. And, of course, this is part of Matthew's concern especially. And for this, the empty tomb must be accompanied by the appearances. And that's what we find now in chapter 20 for this. And there are different reactions. John believes. Peter is perplexed. Mary Magdalene needs to see Jesus. Thomas needs not only to see him, but to touch him for that. So all of this is taken into consideration. There are appearances at the tomb and in a room, an upper room. So there are 4 at least, in John's telling, in and around Jerusalem for that. Now, so it's the first day of the week. That would be Sunday. Sabbath is over. Passover is over. Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark. While it was still dark. There's that notion of dark and light again. Jesus is not there. The stone is removed from the tomb. So she goes to Simon Peter and to John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them, they've taken the Lord from the tomb. So she thinks they've stolen the body. And they don't know where, she doesn't know where he is. So they run, of course, a very famous scene. John gets there first and he waits for Peter to come and such for that. They didn't understand. They didn't understand yet. So they're perplexed for this. With this. John gets there first. He sees and believes. Okay. But Peter is still confused. Then Jesus appears to Mary of Magdala. She is there weeping, sees someone inside who says, "Why are you weeping? You're looking for Jesus. He's not here." Then Jesus himself speaks and says, "Why are you weeping?" In verse 15, "Whom are you looking for?" She doesn't recognize Jesus right away. And again, it's not just the resuscitation of his body the way it was before his death. It is a resurrected body, a glorified body, as theologians call it, for it. So he doesn't recognize her. Neither did the two disciples on the way to Emmaus, in Luke's telling. Didn't recognize Jesus and walked along with him for some distance. But he speaks to her, calls her name, and she recognizes him for that. Clings to him, but of course she can't keep him down in a sense there for that. And he says, "Stop holding on to me. I haven't yet ascended to my Father." And go and tell the disciples. And she does do that for that. Then he appears to the disciples the evening of that first day of the week. And John notes the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. So Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." They're doing is trying to deal with this reality of the risen Jesus. He is not bound by time and space. He can go into a locked room without opening the door. On the other hand, he's not a ghost, and this is especially the function of the scene with Thomas that comes in here. So they rejoice to see him. He gives them his peace for that. He breathed on them, the idea of breath, wind, spirit. In Hebrew, the word for spirit and wind, breath, is the same for this. And so the idea of like the wind, the breath that is over the nothingness, the abyss, before creation, in the beginning of Genesis, God's spirit, breath, wind is there. It's hovering over the presence of God. And so he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Okay, for this. So that's how it is symbolized. And gives them the power to forgive sins. Thomas isn't there. We don't know why. Was he still afraid? Was he disillusioned? Was he full of despair? Was he discouraged? No reason is given, but he's not there. And so the next time he is there and he says, "I'm not going to believe unless I can see it and actually touch him, put my hand into his side and see the nail marks and touch them." So a week later, he is with them. And Jesus again, although the doors were locked, he stands in their midst and says again, "Peace be with you." He puts them at ease. And then he says to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see." Okay. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. And of course, Thomas, his faith is rekindled. My Lord and my God. So again, it's not just a ghost, a figment of his imagination. And also, too, John is teaching us something here. Thomas wasn't there the first time. Jesus could have appeared to him individually, privately, separately, however you want to say it, but he doesn't. He only appears when Thomas is back where he belongs in the community. Think of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. How do they recognize Jesus? In the breaking of the bread. And so Thomas only sees Jesus when he's where he belongs, back with the community. Jesus could have appeared to him anywhere by himself. Doesn't do that. For that. And only to those who have faith. And so he rekindles the faith of Thomas. So Jesus never appears to any of the Pharisees, other members of the Sanhedrin, not to Pilate or anything like that. For it. Okay, then the gospel seems to conclude, and then we have what's called an epilogue, usually by scholars. It continues on in chapter 21 with more appearances for this. So he reveals himself again to the disciples. They're at the Sea of Tiberias. Peter says, I'm going fishing. And so he does. He goes out there. They caught nothing, however. And Jesus is on the shore. And again, they don't recognize him right away, but he calls out to them. And he says, cast the net over to the right side. And they do, and they catch a huge number of fish for that. And again, it's John who says to Peter, it is the Lord. He's the one who recognizes him. And Peter is the one, the impetuous one, the man of action, as we saw from Mark's gospel, who jumps into the water and heads back in. The other disciples come. They weren't too far away from the shore, and they drag in the net with the fish, and they climb out. Now, Jesus has already got a fire going there with some fish on it and some bread. They say, bring some of those that you have caught. And it has 153 large fish in it. Why 153? That's an enigma. We don't know. It seems to be symbolic. Some have tried to say why. Taking a look, some think that in the ancient world they thought there were 153 species of fish. And so by catching 153, it's symbolic that all men and women, all people are called by Christ. And so it's a way of saying all of the world will be caught, the fish, by the apostles who will be fishers of men, not just fishermen, but fishers of men in some symbolic way. Others have said, well, if you take the numbers from 1 to 17 and add them together consecutively, it comes to 153, and then try to figure out the 17, where you've got 12 apostles and one of the other. There are a number of different theories. You can look it up in different commentaries, and that I'm not going to go to all of them now because there's no definitive answer. It is interesting because it is such a specific number, and it's an enigma for us. So you can see what the scholars say about that back and forth with it. Next we have Jesus and Peter speaking, and we have the very famous three times that Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? And of course this seems to be Peter's reconciliation. 3 times he denied him. 3 times he professes his love for him. Do you love me? Yes, you know that I do. For that, even though he denied him 3 times, he gets a chance to rekindle his faith 3 times. And so it balances this out with this. And then we have something that's rather, again, interesting and almost like an enigma. Peter turned, and this is in our epilogue, chapter 21, at verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple following Jesus, whom Jesus loved. The one who had also reclined on his chest during the supper and had said, Master, who is the one who betrayed us? So it's John. Peter said to him, saw him and said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, what if I want him to remain until I come? What concern is that of yours? You follow me. So the word spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus had not told him that he would not die, just, what if I want him to remain until I come? What concern is that of yours? What's going on there? Well, it happens, it seems, that there was a tradition about John, the beloved disciple. Now remember, traditionally he does not die a martyr's death. He lives to a ripe old age, and he is protected by his community that loves him, and so he's protected from persecution and from martyrdom, dies a natural death, perhaps at a great age. Although, remember too, he could be very young at the time of our Lord's public ministry. Jesus is in his 30s. John could still have been much younger, early 20s or so. So if you're trying to work the math out, or that, keep that in mind. John does not have to be the same age as, say, Peter and Jesus and such. He could be much younger. And he dies a natural death. So tradition starts, and in the early church, they had the thought that Jesus was going to return very soon. Paul had this idea, and he had to modify his thought. Some thought that Jesus would come back certainly within their own lifetimes. Maybe next week, next month, within a year. And of course, we're proof that that didn't happen. And Paul has to deal with it. The Thessalonians, for instance, were quitting their jobs and just waiting for Jesus to come back again. It was going to happen so soon. And Paul's got to say, wait a minute, we don't know. Paul himself thought at first it was going to be soon. Then he changed his thought. And so Paul is saying, for instance, in his letters, we don't know. And in the meantime, we've got an awful lot of work that we have to do to spread the gospel. So let's get going and not worry about when Jesus is coming. Amongst other groups as well, they thought that perhaps Jesus was coming soon. And with the fact that John was not martyred, did not die before his time, if you will, as the others did, that a rumor started that Jesus was going to come back before John died. This scene, this part here in this epilogue to John's gospel, and it's still, even though we call it an epilogue, it's part of the canonical gospel. It seems that it's trying to lay that rumor to rest. And Jesus is saying, I didn't say I was going to come back before the apostle dies. I just said, what if I do? Or what if I just want him to remain? It's not your problem, your business, your concern. Your job is to follow me. Don't worry about John or anybody else or when the end is going to come. So that's the laying to rest of the rumor. Don't worry about when the end is going to come. Follow me. In the meantime, you've got a lot of work to do. Same thing that Paul says. We've got the gospel to spread, and we've got to reach the whole world. We don't have a lot of time to do it, each one of us individually, or that. We're still at the task for that. So that's what it seems that is talking about. And finally, we do have the conclusion of the gospel. It is this disciple who testifies to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. So here his community speaking about it, saying it is John who is the force behind this gospel for it. If they're saying, that his testimony is true, they're attesting to him. There are also many other things that Jesus did. But if these were to be described individually, I do not think the whole world could contain the books that could be written. So a bit of a flourish for it as the gospel ends there with it. And finally, we have, as you put all four of these together, a very well-rounded and theological, especially confessional document about the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And remember, all three must go together. So I hope this series has been of a help for you as you read the Passion narratives, perhaps as part of your spiritual reading during Lent. You hear them so quickly when they are proclaimed at the liturgy. You have the chance to sit down and to really go through them little bit by little bit. You can certainly find other books that will explain things in more detail, commentaries. One of the best for John is the Anchor Bible series by Father Raymond Brown in 2 volumes. It's very technical. It's sometimes hard to follow and such. And also Father Raymond Brown's masterful work, The Death of the Messiah, in 2 volumes as well, that go through in quite a great detail of all of this. So I hope this is given with not only John's Gospel here this time, but with the other 3 as well as we've gone through them as part of the episodes for this series, an understanding of what is going on, a little bit more about the background, a little more depth, perhaps answering some questions that might be in your mind as far as to what actually is going on here, things that might seem to be a little bit confusing, some things that might be misunderstood, contradictory even, as you've heard other stories of things, to realize some of the misconceptions that can happen. Also, too, the things that we don't know and that we wonder about. But yet an awful lot of detail is there as well, because this is the summit of Jesus' life. He came among us to teach us and tell us of the love of his Father, but he came especially to redeem us and to show us the love of his Father and his own love for us by dying and by rising. by his passion, his death, and his resurrection to save us all.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.